So we have been discussing a lot of CSS properties, and in this video we'll go ahead and discuss about the opacity, shadow, transform, and the Z-index CSS property. So let us get started with iDigitalPreneur. Now, first of all, let's discuss the opacity property, and as the name suggests, it is used to specify the transparency of any element, and the values of the opacity ranges from 0 to 1, with 0 being the most transparent and 1 being the least transparent of the opacity. And if you want to visualize what the opacity is, an opacity of 30% usually means that it is a value of 0.3. So if you have an element which has like black background and a white text, so an opacity of 1 will give you the true color. And as you start increasing the opacity, that means as the opacity value goes less than 1, you will start to see a considerable difference in the overall transparency of the element. To demonstrate this, what I will do is I will enter an HTML element into my index.html page. So let us just create a div, and I will say this is a box, or rather let's put all of this text inside of a pair of paragraph. This is a box, right? And as you can see, this div is there. So inside of my style.css, I will provide some basic stylings to my div so that it is much more visible. I will give it a width of 300 pixels, a height of 300 pixels as well. I will give a background color of maybe blue violet with a color of text white. And as you can see that this box is already created, I will introduce some padding as well so that there is some separation between the text and the box. And here you can see that the box is there. Now watch what happens if I put in an opacity property, and if I give it a value of 1, I hit on save, I go back, and there is no difference, there is no visual difference in the overall output. But I will start increasing the opacity. That means I will start decreasing the value from 1 to 0. So let's just enter a value which is probably 0.8, or you can say 0.8. And once you go back, you will see that it has become slightly less translucent, and it is now slightly light in color in comparison to the original color that we had. And let me keep on increasing the opacity. Let's make it 0.5. That essentially means 50%. And now you can see that there is a considerable transparency in the element itself. And if I go to a value of 0, that will essentially remove the element from the visual aspect itself, because it has become completely 100% transparent. To kind of show it back, you need to put some value which is greater than 0. So let's just make it 0.3. And now you can see that I can slightly see the object or the HTML element into consideration. So the opacity property ranges from a value of 0 to 1, in which 0 and 1 is 0 and 1, with 0 being the most transparent. That means a transparency of 100%, while 1 means a transparency of 0. That means it is the least or it is the most opaque object in the HTML page. Now let's move on to the next CSS property, that is the Z-index property. And the Z-index property specifies the stacking context of the element from the perspective of the user watching the screen. So to kind of visualize what this stacking context and the Z-index is, consider that this is the screen that you are viewing from this particular position, and the elements are coming towards you. So the element which is the most forwardest of them all is the first element that you see, and all the elements which have a lower stacking context kind of comes behind it. So any element, if you want to create that 3D sort of an effect, or the 3D sort of an effect in the stacking context, you use the Z-index property. To kind of practically visualize what the Z-index is, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create 3 boxes. So let's just create 3 boxes, and I will name all of them as box 1, and this to be of box 2, and this is a div of class box 3. So all of these boxes, and I will insert some text here. Let's say this is box 1 and this is box 2 and this is box 3. Now inside of my CSS, I will give all of my boxes a width of 300 pixels and a height of 300 pixels as well. Now for my box 1, I will give it a background color of, let's say, blue. For box 2, I am going to give it a background color of maybe brown. And for my box 3, I am going to give it a background color of, let's say, tomato. Now all of these boxes, as you can see, are coming right next to each other. Now I will try to stack them up in the same position so that they start overlapping with each other. So to do this, what I will do is I will give all of my boxes a position of absolute, and now you can see all of my boxes are literally on top of each other, with box number 3 kind of overshadowing box number 1 and box number 2, because box number 1 and box number 2 are behind box number 3. Now to kind of see what these is, I will give some top for box 3 so that it moves slightly down. So I will say maybe a top of 30 pixels, and now you can see that box 2 is now visible. Let's give it some more top value so that it is visible more. And now you can see box 2 is visible, and I will also give it some value of 50 pixels on the left so that it moves slightly towards the right. Now you can start to see that there is a 3D sort of an effect coming out, with box number 3 being the most forwardest of them all, and behind box 3 visually you can see the illusion of box 2 to be behind box 2 to be behind box 3. And now what I will do is I will give the same thing to my box 2, but this time the value will be slightly less than 50 pixels, so maybe 30 pixels. And now you can see that box 1 is visible as well. Now you can see that I have started to create a stack, a 3D sort of a stack into consideration. Visually, they are in the same plane, but to the normal user, if I am looking at the screen, I can see that box 3 is in front of box 2 and box 2 is in front of box 1. Now, for any instance, if I want to kind of change the positioning or the overall stacking of my boxes, let's say I want my box 2 to come in front of box 3, but I want to do this with CSS. What I can do is, for my box 2, I need to provide a value of Z-index, and Z-index can take in any negative or positive values. A negative value means that the element will be much more farther away from the user, and a much more higher positive Z-index value means that it will be much more closer to the user. So ideally, every HTML element that you add has a Z-index of 0, and now you can give it any value which is higher than 0. So let us give box 2 to be a value of 3. Now this value is completely arbitrary. You can give it any positive or negative value. And now if I go back, you can see that box 2 has moved ahead of box 3 in terms of the stacking context. That means now box 2 is coming in front of box 3. Although inside of my HTML, I can see that box 2 is coming before box 3 in terms of the overall DOM flow. So this is what Z-index is. And now let's say I want box 1 to be ahead of box 2 as well. So I can go ahead and give my box 1 a Z-index of any value which is greater than 3. Because if I give it a value which is less than 3, it won't make much difference. Rather, box 1 will move ahead of box 3, but it will not move ahead of box 2. That is because by default, box 3 has a Z-index of value 0, box 1 has a Z-index of value 2, and box 2 has a Z-index of value 3. So higher the Z-index value, much more closer to the user that particular HTML element is. So let's give this a value of 10 and see what happens. And now you can see that box 1 has moved ahead of box 2 and box 3 as well. So you can play around by giving the Z-index values, and if you want one particular HTML element to move ahead of another HTML element into consideration in terms of the Z-index, give it a much more higher Z-index value. So this is what Z-index is all about. It is used to control the stacking context of the element. But there is one thing which you always need to take into consideration, that the Z-index property only works for elements which have a position property defined. If you don't define the position property, like here, I have defined the position property of absolute for all of the divs present in my HTML. If I remove this position of absolute, if I go back, now you can see even though I add in Z index for my box 1, box 2 and box 3, yet nothing happens. So you need to provide a position property which needs to be anything apart from static. So even if you give it a position of static, that won't work. It needs to be any other value which is not static. So you can give relative, and you can give absolute, you can give sticky as well. So for the sake of convenience, I gave it a value of absolute, and now you can see that my Z index has started working. So you always need to make sure that the position property of the HTML element is defined. And this is what I was mentioning, that it only works for elements not having the position property set to static, which is the default for any HTML element you put in. Now, the next property that we're going to discuss is the box shadow property. And as the name suggests, it is used to provide a shadow to any HTML element into consideration. So for this purpose, I think the best element to put in a shadow would be a button. So I'm going to go ahead and add a button, and I'm going to say click me, or rather buy now button, right? And let me remove all of this CSS style now because we don't require it. And now you can see that this is the button which I have made. Let's give it some styles so that it looks a little bit prettier than what we usually see our buttons to be. So I will say that the width is maybe 400 pixels, padding of 1 rem, maybe more than that. And I want to give it, let's just decrease the height, width, because it's too much. And now let's give it a background color. I want to give it a background color of tomato. I really love the color before what we did. And I want the text. So I use the color property and I want it to be white, right? And this black border around the button, that is the default behavior, I want to remove it. So there are some properties which you can use. I will use the border property and I will set it to 0. That kind of removes that black outline that we had on the button. And I am pretty much satisfied with what we have right now. Let's just also increase the font size to kind of 2 rems, right? And now, although this is not looking like a button, it's more of a looking like a box, but I'm pretty much satisfied with the button. Now let's go ahead and add a shadow which comes behind the HTML element. So for this, I'm going to use the box shadow property, and the box shadow property takes in a couple of values. So we'll discuss what those values are first, and then we'll move on to the box shadow property. And as we discussed, that it is used to apply a background shadow to any HTML element. And the syntax for box shadow is the value of X, the value of Y, there is a blur value, there is a spread value, and the color of the shadow that you want to apply. So let us see what all of these individual values are. The X coordinate basically determines the position of the shadow on the X axis or the horizontal axis. So in respect to the current HTML element on the horizontal axis, where do you want to position your shadow? That is the value of X, and all of these values takes in values in pixels, rems, ems, or any other CSS unit measurement values that we have. So X is used to determine the X coordinate of the shadow. Similarly, Y is used to control the vertical alignment of the shadow. Where will the shadow occur vertically? Blur is used to control the overall blurriness of the shadow. If you put in a value which is quite large, the shadow will be very blurred. And if you give it a very concise, very small value, the blur of the shadow will be very low. That essentially means that the shadow will be very crisp in nature. And finally, we have the spread value. The spread value is essentially how much spread do you want the shadow to have, and it is again controlled by values in pixels. Higher the spread value, that essentially means much more spread out the shadow will be. And finally, the color of the shadow, you can put your or place your color any particular color you want. So let us see what we can do. I will say that the box shadow, I want the X coordinate to be maybe 5 pixels. I want the Y coordinate to be 5 pixels as well. I want the blur, let's just give it 5 pixels as of right now. I want the spread to be a little bit more, maybe 8 pixels. I'm just ballparking the figure. I don't really have a clear idea what my shadow will look like. And finally, the color of my shadow, I probably want it black. I can change it to any other color as I like. But let's see what this means. And you can see that by giving these particular values, this shadow has been created behind the HTML element. Now you can go ahead and play with the values. So let's say I want the spread to be 20 pixels. And now you can see that the shadow is kind of spreading behind the HTML element because I am increasing the spread value. Similarly, I can increase the blur value as well. And you can see as and when I keep on increasing the blur value, the shadow is going to get much more blurry. With a value of 50 pixels, it is literally quite blurry. And if I give it a value of 1 pixel, you will see a much more concise and a crisp shadow. So usually you want a very blurred out shadow if you want to make it very subtle. So I'll give it maybe a value of 30 pixels, or let's just keep it 50 pixels. And let's try to move the X coordinate and the Y coordinate as well. So I will see 10 pixels if this works. So you can see that it has moved to the right by 10 pixels. Let's also increase the value to see considerable amount, maybe 40 pixels. And now you can see that the shadow has actually moved quite a lot to the right because I'm controlling the value of X. Similarly, I can control the value of Y. Let's give this 30 pixels. And now you can see giving a value of 30 pixels is kind of shifting the shadow down. And I can give negative values as well, which will kind of reverse the direction of the shadow moving. But let's just give this a value of 60 pixels. Now you can see that the shadow is quite down, right? So ideally these values will be something of quite low caliber, maybe 1 pixel and or maybe 3 pixels and 3 pixels, right? And now I can see, and I will also decrease the blurriness or the spread, sorry. So the spread, I want to reduce the spread, maybe 5 pixels will do. And I want to give it a very high blurriness because I want my shadow to be really subtle. And now you can see that my shadow is there. You can play around with the values to kind of achieve the exact shadow you want for the HTML element. And this is how you add any shadow to your HTML elements. Now let's discuss about the transform CSS property. And the transform CSS property are a group of different transformations that you can do on any HTML element, and they are kind of used to rotate, skew, scale, or move any HTML element as per your discretion. The transform CSS property is a really powerful CSS property because it allows you to create some complex looking HTML elements and stylings as well. And there are a lot of different properties, but we will only discuss a few of them. So let us get started. I have my h3 inside of my index.html. I have a h3 which says rotate me, and I will first of all see how we can use the rotation to kind of create a very 3D sort of an effect. So to give it a rotation, we use the transform CSS property, and here I get a list of all of the different transformations that you can do with the transform CSS property, but I am more concerned with the rotate property. Now, the moment I choose rotate, it expects a value in degrees. So I can have any values from 0 to 360 degrees. And let's say I want to rotate it with a value of 10 degrees. So I will write 10 DEG. Mind you, there is no quotes or anything. The values are in 10 DEG, which is degrees. And now you can see that it has slightly rotated 10 degrees to the bottom. I can even give a negative value and I can say minus of 10 degrees and it will rotate up. But now it's moving in the anti-clockwise direction. So the negative and the positive sign kind of determines the clockwise or the anti-clockwise. And let's also give this some more value, let's say 50 degrees, and see what happens. Now it has moved 50 degrees in the clockwise direction. And if it was minus 50, it would have rotated anti-clockwise 50 degrees from the axis. So this rotate property rotates it both on the x as well as on the y property. Let's say you only want to rotate your element on the x-axis. So instead of using rotate, you probably want to use rotate x. And now the rotation happens, suppose this is your x-axis, the rotation happens on this particular axis from 0 to 360 degrees. And as you can see, you might see that the rotate header is slightly decreased in size, but it has actually rotated 50 degrees in the clockwise direction or the anti-clockwise direction because I have used a negative sign. So let's give this maybe 100 degrees and see what happens. And now you can see it has rotated by 100 degrees in the clockwise direction. And this is happening on the x-axis. Similar to x, I can use the y property as well, which will rotate the element on the y-axis. And now you can see that the rotation is happening in the y-axis itself, and it has rotated 100 degrees in the clockwise direction. This is how you rotate your HTML elements. Now, the next transformation that we are going to see is something called translate. So inside of my transform property, I have something called translate, and translate basically moves your element by a certain distance or a certain pixel values. So, or you can expect that the translate moves your element to a certain coordinate. You specify the coordinate in pixels, and it will pixels or normal values, and it will move your element to that particular coordinate. So instead I will say translate, and I want this to be moved by 4040. So now initially just see what happens. This was where my element is, and now I give it a translate of 40 pixels and 40 pixels, and now it has moved 40 pixels towards the x-axis and 40 pixels towards the y-axis as well. Let's increase the value 100 pixels. It has moved 100 pixels down. So this is used to move your HTML element. It kind of functions the same way like top, bottom, left and right, but translate the translate property is much more performant in comparison to the top, left, bottom and right, and it is usually used in animations. Whenever you are adding animations using CSS, then this particular translate property helps you move a particular object from one position to another position, because the translate property uses the coordinate system of x and y. Similar to the rotation, if you want to only move it on the x-axis and not on the y-axis, so instead of translate, you use the translate x, and this will be pixels, and now it's moving on the x-axis itself and not on the y-axis. Similar to x, you can have translate of y with a capital X and capital Y, and now instead of moving on the x-axis, it will move or translate on the y-axis itself. Now the next transform property that we're going to see is something called skew, and skew is usually understood as the amount of movement of the HTML element. If you keep the axis of the element constant, and if you move the element on the x-axis and the y-axis, it will kind of distort the HTML element. So the next CSS property that we're going to study is the skewness. And to understand what skewness is the movement or the distortion of the HTML element by keeping the base axis same and kind of distorting it in the direction of X or Y, and the values are usually considered in degrees. So you can use the skew property and you can say that I want the skewness to be around 20 degrees, and if I go, you can see that the element is starting to get distorted. That means the base is getting the same constant behavior, while the element is getting skewed by or distorted by an angle of 20 degrees. So I can increase the value, let's just say 100 degrees, and now you can see that the value or the HTML element has skewed a lot. So skewness is essentially the distortion, and you can use X and Y to kind of control your skewness both on the X axis as well as on the Y axis. Now the final transform property that we're going to study is the scale. And let me first of all add in a button, because that way it will make more sense what the scale does. And let's say this is a click me button, and let's move this H3 because we don't require it. And inside of my button, I will say that the font size is 1 rem, right? And now let's give this a scale. So I want the button to increase in size once I hover over it. We will read about the pseudo classes and pseudo elements in the later videos, but just for demonstration purpose, I will add in a pseudo class of hover, and I will say whenever the user hovers on the button, I want to scale it up, and scale usually takes in a value in decimals and whole numbers. That means you are specifying by what factor do you want to increase the HTML element. So let us say I want to increase it with a factor of 2 after the user has hovered over the button. So now once I hover over the button, you can see that the size of the button has increased to twice of whatever the size of the button was initially. And you can add in any values here. You can add in a value of 1.1, and now you can see that this scaling up and scaling down effect is there, and usually this is where the scale property you comes in with. Once we start learning about animations, all of the transform properties will make much sense. But scale is essentially used to transform or kind of create the HTML element and increase or decrease the HTML element by a certain factor, which you can determine inside of the pair of brackets. So this was all about the different CSS properties that we learned so far. There are other properties as well, but because of the scope of the course that we are doing, it's not possible to discuss each and every transform property. But mostly major animations use these transform properties, and you will be using all of them in 90 to 95% of the cases. Hopefully this video was informative. We will keep on discussing. We are almost at the end of the CSS module, just a couple of more concepts to go, so hold on tight, and I will see you all in the next video.